Right, okay. Yeah, one interesting thing about writing and even speaking as well is that as you go through the phases of self-realization, what you will find is that your higher mind will start talking instead of your lower mind. Because as you go through the transformation, the lower mind and higher mind actually start coming together, and you start to talk or write from a place of higher mind. And at the start, that comes in dribs and drabs. So there's a mixture of both, and it's difficult to figure out sometimes. And sometimes you'll start saying things you don't even know what you're saying. Or you'll say something and go, "Oh, I didn't even know I knew that," or something like that. But that's the journey of intuition. That's part of the journey of intuition that you go through the phases of self-realization. So it's interesting to start noticing those kind of things. Right then, we've asked you guys the question of what healing means to you. And healing, of course, is a fairly subjective thing. And there's lots of different versions of healing, and there's lots of different approaches to healing. So we thought we should start by giving you the version of healing that we're working towards, what healing means to us, I guess. But this diagram I'm going to go through today, it's a bit of an overview, let's say, because so many different modes or modalities of healing exist, and they all focus on perhaps different parts of healing. But it's important for us to get an overview of what's going on. And to get the overview, you actually have to really sit back and look at the whole picture. And what is better than looking at the whole picture by actually looking at the whole universe or the source of the universe? You have to actually zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What is the universe up to? What is the source of the universe up to? So this is what we have done with this particular diagram, which I'm going to share with you. So this diagram is, there's a lot of information on it, and it's not necessarily designed for the general public. It's designed for the healers in Network Healers, so that we can sort of bring all aspects of healing together and see if we can look at the bigger picture and see what's going on. So I'm going to go through this bit by bit and explain each part to you. And this is uploaded into Google Classroom, of course, so you can go and have a look at this afterwards if you want. So this is the Aya Guide to Healing. So we're going to start at the top. So what we've started with is a universal law of healing. Now, the reason why we're calling this particular law of healing universal is because this applies everywhere in the universe. And hopefully this will make sense to you once I've explained the diagram. But there's what's going on this planet. There's a journey of life and an evolution of life on this planet, and certain things will apply on this planet. But who knows what other systems exist out there in the universe, of course. But there are some fundamental principles that are going to be the same everywhere. So what we've done with the universal law of healing is that we've generalized healing into a simplified law of healing. Now, this will seem a little bit abstract to start with, but hopefully by the end of the lesson and when we go through the diagram, it will make sense. So first of all, separation. Separation leads to suffering. Now, to have suffering, which you could call negative emotions in humans, negative emotions, to have negative emotions, you must have positive. So there must be a split, or what we call a duality, to be able to have a negative part. So separation is what causes suffering. But also the universe goes on a journey of separation. It loses itself in that separation, and it suffers because of it. And it suffers because it is ignorant of itself, or of its own true nature, which we'll talk about more in a second. So the antidote to suffering is, first of all, balancing the two sides of the duality, which leads to surrender. Now, surrender is an interesting concept, but this needs to happen through the journey of healing. And what surrender actually is, if you take it down to its fundamentals, is that through this separation, it creates a universe of form, a universe of separated form, even down to different types of energy, positive and negative energy, or or electrical charge. It creates separation. And through the journey of life, life evolves in a separated way. And in humans, this culminates in what we call the egoic identity, the little self, a sense of individuality that we have. That is actually an illusion, because ultimately the universe is unified. It's one. But it creates separation, which creates suffering and individuality, and we suffer because we are individuals. So therefore, after balancing of the two sides of duality, we have to surrender our individuality. The egoic identity, or the little self, or the false identity, or the mask identity, whatever you want to call it, it has to surrender its own existence, because only after it does that will it find unity and then peace. So that little journey there, balance, surrender, unity and peace, that is the journey of healing. And it is also the journey of self-realization, the journey of self-realization of the source of the universe. So the universe creates separation and loses itself, goes on a journey of separation and individuality. The one becomes the many. And then at some point, it finds balance, it finds surrender, or it goes through a journey of surrendering that individuality, and it finds that it was unified all along. It was a unity, it was one. So the veil of illusion is lifted, you could say. And in doing so, it finds peace and self-realization. We'll talk about that more in a second. And that is the journey of healing. So this will apply everywhere in the universe. You know, the journey of life may be very different in different parts of the universe, but this law of healing should be the same everywhere. Now, please do jump in if you've got any questions or comments or anything to say, okay? So that's the universal law of healing, and now we're going to go into it in more detail on this particular planet where we have life. So this, this diagram is set up from left to right, you could say. Goes on a journey from left to right and then comes back to the left and starts again in a cyclical way. So let's start on the left-hand side here. And we are going to start with the source, the non-physical source. Now, I should start off by saying something about non-physical and physical, because these words can be used differently depending on how you mean them. You know, it's all about language, isn't it? So I want to clarify exactly what we mean when we use the word physical and non-physical. You know, often people, when they use the word physical, they will be thinking about matter. They'll be thinking about solidity, won't they? That's what we call the physical body sometimes, don't we? Made of atoms and molecules. Well, actually, we want to slightly move that definition of physical. We want to use the word physical for everything in the universe which has form. And that includes everything which has energy. Anything which is made of energy, we're saying here, is physical. Because the source of the universe, which is awareness, is actually non-physical, completely non-physical. It's outside of space, outside of time. So if we use the word non-physical to mean things like what the soul is made of, subtle energy and things like that, then we've got nowhere to go to call or to describe the source of the universe as non-physical. So what we're saying here is that everything that has form, that is made of energy, is physical form. And that includes matter, that includes magnetic type of energy. So lots of different types of energy. There's material energy, there's magnetic energy, lots of different types of energy. The soul is made of magnetic energy, for example. The astral planes are made of magnetic energy or information in magnetic energy, subtle energy. Chi or prana, if we want to use those words. All that has form. You know, even light is an electromagnetic wave which runs through the vacuum of empty space. But that has form. So everything in the physical universe of form, that's physical. The source, however, is non-physical. It's nowhere, but it's everywhere. It's not in dimensions, and it's not in time, and it's infinite. So that's what we mean by non-physical. So back to the diagram here. The non-physical source, you could say here is in a state of non-self-awareness, and it creates separation. And if you remember from last week, that's our little symbol there, which means awareness. But it creates separation or duality. So moving up this side, there's a red dot there with an arrow pointing in a particular direction. And on the other side here, there's a black dot with the arrow pointing in the opposite direction. And that is because at the fundamental level, the creation of energy is created in positive and negative. And the only difference there, really, the main difference, is the rotation of that energy. And from then on, everything else that's created out of that positive and negative energy is created with that separation, with that duality. In fact, you could say that the universe can't exist without that duality. That's what makes form possible. That's what the separation is. It's actually, if we want to actually define energy, and we'll talk about it later on in the course, but you could say that energy is information in movement. It's information which is moving, and that information is called akasha. But we'll talk about that later on. So a separation is formed, one positive, one negative, and it's the rotation that is important. Now, throughout the journey of the universe and the journey of life, so life evolves on planets, and on this planet, it's evolved in a particular way, and it's evolved to reincarnate. So here, part of this in the center here, all this stuff in the center really is the journey of life. And it's got these teardrops in here, these teardrop shapes. That represents reincarnation. Each one of them, you could say, represents a life. Obviously, it's not to scale because there's thousands of incarnations, but it's symbolic. So at the start here, you've got the evolution of life and the evolution of reincarnation. Now, one interesting thing here to note is that when energy is created, it's created with an imbalance to it. There is a negative dominance to it. Now, to really understand that, we have to talk about the universal trinity, which is something we're going to talk about later on in a later lesson. But for now, it's just important to know that when energy is created, there is an imbalance between negative and positive. And that shows up in various aspects throughout the journey of life. Just one example is the emotional imbalance in humans. So emotions evolved millions of years ago as a survival mechanism. But the memory of negative emotions is always ingrained deeper than the memory of positive emotions, because it's a more basic survival trait to keep an animal alive, keeping away from dangerous situations. That's a matter of life or death, let's say, for that animal. But throughout the journey of life, it creates an imbalance. And we can see it today as humans. We tend to remember or focus or worry about the negative things that happen to us in our lives more than the positive. We remember the negative more than the positive, and sometimes it even defines us. So there is a negative imbalance there, and that's important when we get to later stages of the journey. So the journey of life progresses, let's say, through the animal kingdom, biological evolution, which is the same as spiritual evolution. The evolution of reincarnation is a biological system that moves along with biological evolution. So at some point, the journey of a soul goes through all these animal species, incarnates through the species, and progresses and progresses and progresses as the species evolve, and jumps the species gap into new species. So the soul is evolving through species of animals with increasing complexity, increasing self-awareness, increasing intelligence, till at some point on the planet, humans evolve. And this is where suffering really starts to intensify, you could say. Because these cycles of reincarnation now start being cycles of suffering because of this massive dominance in negative emotions. And this is where, and let me just go back a little bit actually, emotions evolved in early animals but they evolved as a consequence of the separation, the duality. So positive emotions evolved, and retention of positive emotions, or emotional memory, is karma emotion. And genetics is involved as well, but we'll talk about that later on. So positive emotions evolved, but with positive emotions, desire evolved, which is just there, desire. But desire is a negative emotion. It is a wanting, it is a lack, it is a pain. So that's why we've got a little arrow, a black arrow going all the way down here to the negative side, just to show that desire actually is a negative emotion. So positive emotions actually just lead to negativity. Well, most of them do. Unconditional love is an exception. We'll talk about that in a second. And then on the negative side, negative emotions evolved in the same way. And karma emotion being the transport mechanism for emotional memory. So in humans, these cycles of suffering started to evolve. Now, personally, I think that the age of suffering on this planet is really predominantly the last 12,000 years or so. Probably timed along with agriculture, the invention of agriculture and humans starting to congregate in big cities and things like that. Obviously, suffering evolved before that, but suffering was really ramped up at that point because the human ego was really ramped up at that point. But anyway, it's part of the journey of life because the source actually awakens from its suffering. So how does it actually do that? So at some point during this journey, these cycles of suffering, constant incarnating again and again and again with this negative imbalance, too much negative karma, not enough positive karma. We get to a certain point. We get to this point here where you can see that something happens. This is what happens. So at some point in the journey of a soul's existence, it goes from a state of being what we call a sleeping higher mind to a recognition of itself. Now, we want to make sure we use that word and not awakening or realization, because it's completely different. When the higher mind, when the soul recognizes its own reincarnation, then it starts its healing journey. And what we mean by that is that the soul suddenly becomes aware that it is reincarnating, because before that it was all done automatically. It's just a natural process. Reincarnation is a natural process. Animals are doing it all the time. Humans are doing it all the time. And at some point in the human journey, that soul becomes aware that it is reincarnating. As soon as it starts doing that, then it starts to be able to analyze its own levels of karma in the energy body. Then it starts getting its past life memories. It starts remembering past lives. And at this point, it can actually start to change the way things are going. And this is when it starts growing its Kundalini system. So the Kundalini system is a system in the energy body which grows naturally. Once the higher mind has recognized itself, it starts to build its own Kundalini system. And the Kundalini system is a system of emotional intelligence in humans, because it connects the emotion chakras together. So there are hundreds of chakras around the body. We're going to go over this lots, don't worry. There are hundreds of chakras around the body. There are 5 important ones, which are the emotion regulating chakras. Now that is from the throat to the root, those 5 major chakras which sit along the spinal column. Those regulate our emotions. And the Kundalini system starts growing up through those chakras and connecting them together. And then it connects it into the lower mind and allows the lower mind to start analyzing emotions. And that is needed to find balance. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So at this point in the soul's journey, Kundalini growth starts. Now that's not Kundalini awakening. Let's not get those two mixed up. Kundalini awakenings later on. This is growth of the Kundalini system. So at this very point, this is where the healing journey starts for that soul. So this is why we've got the word healing starting here in green. And from this point on, That soul is now starting to plan its incarnations. It plans where it's going to go. It plans what it's going to do. It starts making soul families, connecting with other higher minds. In fact, to be honest with you, I think most of the time, a soul, when it's ready for its own recognition of reincarnation, it gets nudged by other higher minds. I think that's pretty much how it works. And then soul families start to spring up. So at that point, the healing journey starts for that soul. And every incarnation it takes a long time. It takes many, many lifetimes to actually learn all these tricks. But from this general point onwards, that soul has got a purpose. It knows the end game. It knows why it's there, and therefore it angles every life towards it. And it builds a life plan and tries to keep its lower mind on that life plan through intuition, which we'll talk lots about later on. So from that point onwards, these cycles of suffering, they start getting squeezed. They start getting smaller, because the idea is to, first of all, increase positive karma, because that imbalance needs to be addressed. To find balance between positive and negative, we need to increase positive karma, and at the same time decrease negative karma. So that's what life plans are all about for higher minds. And we do that through emotional lesson learning. And the higher mind has to learn through the lower mind. That's the learning mechanism of the soul, which we'll talk about later on in the reincarnation lesson. So these cycles of suffering get smaller and smaller and smaller. This imbalance starts to come down, and overall levels of karma start to drop as well. So as you can see, these teardrops are changing shape because the positive karma is increasing, and the overall amount of karma that's being produced gets smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally we get to this point here. When a soul or a high mind has equal amounts of positive and negative karma, and small enough amounts of positive and negative karma, it can be ready for a Kundalini awakening. And the Kundalini system has to have grown completely for that to happen. And the Kundalini system, by the way, which we'll talk about lots, but it goes from just underneath the root chakra all the way up the spine, past the 8th, and then up to the 9th chakra, which is actually about 2 foot above your head. We'll talk about that later on. So this is why we need a very small amount of karma left over to have a Kundalini awakening. Because if a Kundalini awakening happens before that person is ready, there'll be too much negative karma, which then produces too much emotional energy, because burning karma produces emotional reactions. Now we'll talk about that in the karma emotion engine lesson. But if there is too much negative karma, it produces too much negative emotional energy, which then produces too many negative emotions, and it causes too many blockages in the emotion chakras. When there's too many blockages in the emotion chakras, Kundalini awakening, which starts from the base of the spine, explodes underneath the root chakra. If there is a big blockage in the root chakra, I mean too big, Kundalini energy hits it really hard and sends shockwaves out through the nervous system, and can cause all sorts of problems, all sorts of neurological problems, and all sorts of emotional problems as well. So Kundalini awakening should only happen when the time is right. And this is why we have a big problem, I would say it's a big problem in the world right now with Kundalini, because everybody wants to awaken their Kundalini, whether they're ready or not. And it causes huge amounts of problems. So we should never actually teach Kundalini yoga, in my opinion. We should teach about Kundalini, the Kundalini system, because that's just anatomy. Everybody needs to understand it. But we shouldn't teach methods to awaken the Kundalini. It should happen on its own. And when it does happen on its own. There's no stopping. So Kundalini awakening, that is the physiological side of self-realization. That's what allows self-realization to happen. So moving forward in this diagram, that leads to a recognition. The universe recognizes itself as one awareness. Now that's one sentence, but actually that's a long journey in itself. It starts with a recognition that the awareness behind the mind stream is you, the true self. That's where it starts. That first recognition of, that's me. I'm not that personality that's ever changing, goes up and down throughout the course of my life. That's not me. It's that silent awareness behind the mind. That's me, the true self. That's you. That's the first recognition. But then it doesn't stop there, because then you start to realize that awareness is not just limited to you. It is everywhere. We start to have feelings of unity. And then the universe itself recognizes its own awareness through you, or through conscious beings in the universe. That's universal self-awareness. So that's what leads to self-realization. It also leads to infinite deep peace. Now we're going to talk about that a fair bit in this course as well. There's different levels of peace. You can be at peace, you can have inner peace, but then there is deep peace, which is on a completely different level to inner peace. And this is where you feel it everywhere, infinitely. It's not just limited to you, it is everywhere. And by the way, that color pink, that particular color of pink is what we're using as the color of unity. So whenever you see that pink, that is referring to unity. And the last thing to mention just here is vision. And vision comes after unity. And vision of everything. There's lots of different meanings to that. Vision of the self, the true self, but also other types of vision. Vision of the source, vision of the astral planes, vision of your past incarnations. All different types of vision come after that. But really at that point, it is the source of the universe which is starting to see. Okay, any questions so far? So we'll talk about that more in the reincarnation lesson, but there's different levels of planning that we can talk about here. Okay, so there is actually a universal infinite plan of the source. That's one way of looking at it. The universe is completely deterministic, infinitely deterministic. That means predetermined. So everything has a plan, you could say. The stone has a plan, the flower has a plan, everything. If you want to separate it into very individual little pieces, you could say that everything has an individual plan, because it is the source itself. Really, it's just one plan. It's just a unified, infinite plan. But yeah, if you separate it out, you can say that every single individual thing has a plan, has a journey through the existence of the universe, let's say. But when we're talking about life plans or higher mind life plans, that's a different thing. That is a higher mind which is actively thinking and planning its incarnation. So that's a completely different thing than the universal life plan. So a higher mind that has not yet become recognized or not yet recognize its own reincarnation is not making life plans in that way. It's not making its own organized life plan. It's buffeted along through the journey of life, which is also the part of the universal infinite plan. Does that make sense? The different directions that energy goes in and out of a chakra is related to the spins of the two donut shaped, or the toruses, that are part of the chakra mechanism. Now we'll go through chakra anatomy later on, but you've got basically two donut shapes, and they're spinning in different directions, and it's causing the energy that's flying out of a chakra is spinning in a spiral shape, and it's because of that spinning donut. The other the energy that's getting sucked in around the outsides is also spinning in the opposite direction. But I'd never, to be honest, I'd never made any connection between that and a duality. I mean, there are lots of things in the world which have duality. I mean, the whole of the universe is created with duality, so you see duality all the way through life, and but I don't think that's necessarily an example of a duality. Well, I suppose you could say that the whole concept of, say, clockwise and anti-clockwise could be an opposite. I suppose you could say. Yeah. So that's you could say that it does happen at the same time for some people. Let's say for a soul group, it happens roughly at the same time, and this group of people is a perfect example. We've got together in this incarnation to become self-realized together. So in that way, it can happen at the same time. But yes, you're right. It doesn't happen for the whole of the population of the planet. And the reason would be you'd have to go back to the start of how souls are actually evolved and generated. Because you could say that souls are still being made today. So, the first souls that were ever evolved were right back at the start or I think it happened actually around when small reptiles and small mammals were pretty much the most evolved thing on the planet. I think that the high mind evolved from the lower mind because I think they have a common they look like they've got a common ancestor because they've got some of the same anatomy. But at some point, the soul or the high mind evolved the capability to exist outside of the material body after death and then jump back into another generation. But that happened over millions of years evolution probably. But then that kept happening. So souls are evolving all the time or being generated all the time, you could say. And I think they're still being generated now. Whenever we've got small animals on the planet, souls are still evolving. So you could say that the first souls ever to evolve or to start on this planet become self-realized at a certain point. But then if souls are evolving now, then it's going to take another, God knows how long for them to get to self-realization. So it's like a conveyor belt of souls going through the journey of life and becoming self-realized when they have become ready. Right, so just back to the diagram then. Well, I think that now suffering would have started before that because it depends what your exact definition of suffering is. But what I was saying there is that suffering got ramped up, I think, at that stage because, and I link it to the start of agriculture really, which started from about 12,000 to about 5,000 years ago, something like that. And that's when the human ego really ramped up. Money was invented, cities were invented, the human ego started becoming really developed, and cruelty. This was all ramped up at that particular point. So that's the only reason why I'm linking. And what? Sorry. Yeah, I guess. I mean, the science is a loss. It's very recent, I suppose you could say. Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess it depends where you draw the line. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you could draw the history of science back to philosophy. I mean, it started as it was called natural philosophy, wasn't it? And that was thousands of years ago. Absolutely. But the thing is, you could say that science is just an offshoot of the desire for knowledge, the desire for the universe to know itself through people. So yeah, you could say that from the early days of trying to understand the world around us, you could call that science really. But I guess when I use the word science, I'm talking about the scientific revolution of modern science, which is the last sort of 400 years or so. But you're absolutely right. Science. There was not a line where science was, science was created. It evolved from natural philosophy, which evolved from natural religions and things like that. So it's just one. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's down to the growing human ego. You could say the egoic identity, which starting to magnify. Yeah, it'd be nice to see more of a blend going forward. Intuitive science, let's say. All right, and so just going back to this diagram then. So we've talked about the universal law of healing. We talked about how separation causes suffering because the universe loses itself. It loses its self-awareness in that separation. It needs that separation though. I mean, it really does. The universe would not exist without that duality. It's the journey of life. It's the journey of the universe. It's the purpose of the universe to lose its self-awareness and then regain it through awakening from its suffering. Now, I should just mention here that a common thing for people to think here is to get a little bit disillusioned and go, well, why is there suffering? Why does it have to do it this way? Now, we should always remember that the age of suffering that we're talking about here, if you look at really massive scales, it's only tiny. It's tiny, 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 really. If you look at the journey of the planet, let's say, it's been around for about 4.5 billion years or so. And it's going to be around for a lot longer. And, the age of suffering, if we're just talking about 12,000 years, for an example, it's tiny. It's tiny. It's almost like on cosmic scales, it's just like a line that the universe crosses over. It suffers and then it awakens and it flowers and it self-awareness or self-realization unfolds dramatically. So that journey, let's go back to that journey of healing or journey of self-realization. Because at this point, from where that healing journey starts in the soul, then it's various things along the way which contribute to that healing. Various things along the way which the soul learns as it goes through its incarnations. And things that it tries to point its lower mind towards through intuition. Now, you guys have been doing this a long time. Countless incarnations following a particular path, following the spiritual path. Every incarnation, again and again and again, doing these same things to try and decrease the levels of karma and decrease the levels of negative karma and stop trying to produce more. Because that's a big problem with karma. It's cyclical. You produce some negative karma, and while you're burning it, you produce some more. And while you're burning that, you produce some more. So that's a big part of people's life plans, or high minds' life plans, is to stop producing more. And this is where we get into the layers of the human system, the layers of the healing pyramid, which is material body layer, bioenergy layer, emotional layer, psychological layer, and spiritual layer. And this is the sort of thing that you guys have been helping other people with for a long time. So I've put network healers on this because this is an AYA course, a network healers symbiosis course. So, but of course there are many different systems of healing. But on this diagram, we've got the network healers system. And those are the principles of network healers, which we went through last week. Self-healing, the book of codes, karma emotion, a network of healers, energy healing, and bioenergy anatomy. And the seventh principle, awareness. And then here we've got clinic and health flow. So these are departments or programs within network healers. Clinic, just to remind you, clinic being the one where there's a high level of interactivity with the healing partner. And the reason why is because self-healing is so important. Self-healing plus energy healing, that's the clinic. People need to take responsibility for their healing journey. They need to learn about their healing journey, and they need to progress through their healing journey under their own steam, let's say. That's why clinic is so important in that respect, teaching people. So if you think about it, if you think about this diagram in totality, you could say that the best way or the highest form of healing that you can give somebody is to help them along their way of spiritual evolution, to help them towards that goal, to help them towards self-realization. Now, there's lots of aspects to healing, of course, but with that overarching goal in mind, we can make that as a base for everything we do. Getting people to evolve quicker, or to remove the cycles of suffering quicker, and then all the other layers of healing on top of it. And I've just named a few different types of healing here. Intention healing, that's the type of healing. We're going to learn about this in energy healing. So these are, and intention healing is a form of energy healing. Non-intention healing is another form of energy healing that comes from our higher minds. And then conventional mainstream healthcare, I want to put that on there just to be clear that we work in a complementary manner with mainstream medicine and healthcare. And then Maya healing. Maya healing is another type of healing, more advanced, and we'll talk about that later on. But the word Maya actually means the veil of illusion, but we'll talk about that later on. And that goes into healing, helping people at this part of the journey, or any part of the journey, really. That's right, yes, it is a Sanskrit word originally, yeah, 100%. And it's that meaning that we mean. That's where we've got that word from, because the veil of illusion, Maya is the Sanskrit word for the idea that the whole of the physical reality of form is a type of illusion, because it's separation. The separation of energy is an illusion, because the ultimate reality of the universe, the permanent reality of the universe, is one. It's unity. And this separation is transient. This separation is impermanent. Therefore, it is not real compared to the reality, the infinite and permanent source of the universe. So the veil of illusion crumbles through the journey of self-realization, because we realize that unity. Okay, so let me go through a couple of these summaries. So separation, I'll just read this for you so you don't have to squint. Separation and unity. We are born into a natural world that has separation between forms. This duality separates us from our source and causes us suffering due to the ignorance of our own true nature, which is infinite unity, unconditional love, and a state of deep peace. Through a journey of healing, we are able to return to the source. It's like returning home. Now, karma, values, and balance. Karma, values, and balance is a simplified version of this diagram. We must remove negative karma emotion, choose healthy values, and that will help us to stop creating more negative karma. And in doing so, we find balance. The layers of the human system. So we do this, we get balance, we get to balance by applying corrective measures to the 5 different layers of the human system. The material, physical, the bioenergy, the emotional, the psychological, and the spiritual. This is the background state of our own awareness once the duality and the turbulence of emotions have been balanced. So that's a summary there on the diagram. A couple more things I want to show you on the diagram are over here. So we said earlier that positive emotions, even though they feel positive, they lead to negativity because they lead to a desire. They lead to a desire for more of those positive emotions. So really, just wanting positive emotions, we're still in the prison of the mind. The positive and negative, even if we just constantly strive to be positive, constantly strive to feel positive emotions, we're always still going to be trapped in that duality. However, there is an emotion which is different. The emotion of unconditional love, which is an emotion which we call the highest emotion, that is free from desire completely. There is no desire at all involved. And by the way, the color there of unconditional love, that's actually the frequency or the color of unconditional love. And that is why that deep electric blue color. And that is why, as you go through self-realization, as you go through the Kundalini phase of self-realization, your heart chakra actually turns that color. It goes from a green color, which is normally the heart chakra is a green color, and it turns to deep electric blue color. So later on in the course, when we're going to be doing chakra breathing and things like that, you can test it out on yourself to notice that your heart chakra is now electric blue, deep electric blue. And the reason is because the type of love changes from, let's say, ego love or lower mind love to unconditional love. And the green color of lower mind love is usually love plus a negative emotion. Now, it's perfectly normal in life to have love plus a negative emotion, of course. Love plus fear is usually the most popular, you could say. Fear for a loved one. That's love plus fear. And of course, it's natural, but it is conditional. It is a conditional love. Whereas unconditional love doesn't have any direction towards anyone and has no conditions attached to it. And this is what we want to apply in our virtual healing centre. And our virtual healing centre, I haven't talked about that yet, but that's going to be an online virtual healing centre of which Network Healers is a part of. There's going to be all sorts of different types of healing on it. Network Healers is going to be a big part of that virtual healing centre. And that goes into helping people with this healing journey. We've got this bit here on there as well, karma, values, balance. Now, it's just a simplified way of seeing this diagram for human healing. Karma, values, and balance, nice and easy to remember. We need to deal with our karma. We need to produce or learn the right values to stop producing more and to get rid of what we got, which leads to balance, which will lead towards the unity. Okay, just a couple more things to read. We're time for a break, but it'll only take a couple of minutes, so let me just read these. So the true self, there's a little bit about the true self here. Self-realization is the realization that our true being is not the body or the mind and personality, but something far deeper and permanent. Our awareness is actually the consciousness of the universe itself. Permanent experience and realization of this is the highest form of healing. And what about reincarnation and karma emotion? Karma emotion is a transport system for emotional memory over subsequent incarnations. Reincarnation is the natural biological method of retaining emotional memory over many incarnations. There is always a negative dominance that leads to cycles of suffering. To reverse this, an understanding of the mechanisms of reincarnation and karma emotion is necessary. And lastly, just to remind you, saw this last week, awareness, which is timeless, dimensionless, infinite, conscious peace. And lastly, I would say, I haven't mentioned, just quickly, just going back to the network healers part here, structuring the healing journey. So structuring the healing journey is a lesson that we're going to go through later on, and we have a form to fill out for structuring the healing journey. So when we get a healing partner, we fill out a form. Well, we interview them, we get as much information as possible, and then we start planning their healing journey. And we've got a form to help us, basically. But this diagram really is integral to structuring the healing journey, because it's all based around one aim at the end of the day. Yeah, you might think that it's an extreme question, but it's actually quite a popular one. So the journey of life has evolved on this planet is not necessarily going to be exactly the same as the journey of life that has evolved on other planets. But I mean, there may well be reincarnation on other planets, but there doesn't have to be reincarnation on other planets. You can imagine there's always going to be a cycle. There's always going to be a cyclical aspect of life, however that manifests in the journey of life. And in this particular planet, we've got a higher mind and a lower mind, which is so that the higher mind incarnates and learns through the lower mind, and then leaves the lower mind, lower mind plus material body there. That's one incarnation, lower mind plus material body. The soul is the higher mind plus the energy body. And it incarnates again and again and again in a cyclical way. I could imagine that is going to be, there's going to be some cyclical aspect to life everywhere in the universe, because everything in the universe is made of cycles. So, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same way. It's not going to evolve exactly the same way. You can see by the journey of life, even on this planet, of the different life forms that there are on this planet. So I would say that it's not anatomically possible to go and incarnate in another species, because our reincarnation is tied to the anatomy of our species. In fact, you can't even go backwards and incarnate into an animal once you've evolved past that certain level. It's a bit like, reproduction in a way, like two species that are very close in anatomy can reproduce, can't they? Like a lion and a tiger can reproduce. They call it a liger. But say a lion and an antelope, they can't reproduce. The species are too far apart because the anatomy is too different. So in the same way, I mean, it's an analogy, but in the same way, reincarnation will be the same. The soul has certain anatomy. The souls from this planet will have a certain anatomy. For example, there are gluing points which glue the energy body into the lower mind framework. And all the chakras, the hundreds of chakras around the body, are gluing points. The bindu is another gluing point. There's loads of different attachment points in the body. And that is, it needs to be the same, the anatomy needs to match up, let's say. But addressing the idea that a lot of people feel like they've been on other planets and things, because, you might, everyone here might not have heard of that, but it's quite a popular thing. And with globalization and the internet, everything, we're hearing more and more about different people's viewpoints and experiences. But I would say that is the idea of feeling like you've been on another planet is not entirely incorrect, but it's misunderstood exactly what's going on, because you can spend time in between incarnations. You can spend time in the astral. Now, you are in the astral naturally in between incarnations, but you can actually spend time in the astral dimensions of other planets, because all planets are actually linked together through the astral dimensions. So it's a bit like the internet. It's a bit like surfing the internet. That's what astral planes are like. It's uploading and downloading information. So you can actually go and surf the astral planes, you could say. And you can spend years and years and years in other places in the astral planes, decades, in fact. And so when you come back into an incarnation, because you have to come back into an incarnation on this planet to burn away your negative karma, because the negative karma is burnt away in the organs in the lower mind framework. So that's why you have to come back into an incarnation to burn away negative karma. But when you're in that incarnation, you've got this subconscious aspect or memories coming back that you feel like you've been somewhere else. So I think that's where those kind of those feelings and memories come from. And that was a very long and long-winded and complicated answer. Yeah, that's an interesting question, isn't it? What we need to do, I think, is to get as many people as possible to the point of recognition, for their higher minds to recognize their own reincarnation. Because from that point onwards, that higher mind becomes aware of itself, aware of its own reincarnation, and starts to plan its own healing journey. So I would say that is the most important thing to start with. And really, you could say that's, if you dig down into it, a big part of that is teaching about reincarnation, because the higher mind learns through the lower mind. So it's lower minds teaching lower minds at the end of the day, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, you're right, and to be honest, you're not going to be able to get every soul to be aware of its own reincarnation, because people don't until they're ready. So you have to go on that journey. That the soul has to go through the steps on that journey. You can speed it up for people, but you can't make massive jumps like that. So I guess for people that you're talking about, it's a case of finding what works for them best. You've got a whole range of aspects of healing, and it's just about picking the right one that resonates with them and trying to pick away at that education, bit by bit, depending on what they respond to, really, because some people respond to different things, don't they? Some people are very, very rooted in the material body, and so material body health is going to be the most important to them. Some people respond more to the psychology aspect. So I guess every case is slightly different, isn't it? Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if you can work out where they are, say, in their Kundalini journey, then you know roughly what kind of lesson learning they're going through or they need to go through. Once the Kundalini growth has started, yeah, if somebody's at the sacral chakra, then you know that the general type of emotional intelligence that they're going through, because the five chakras have specific sets of characteristics in the personality that they regulate. This is the concept of energy psychology, where the root chakra is about safety, security, and survival, and the sacral is about reproduction and parental care, and the solar plexus is about identification with beliefs. The heart chakra is about attachment to loving relationships, and the throat chakra is about communication of self-expression. So this is the Kundalini growth through those chakras is a journey of lesson learning, of emotional lesson learning. So, yeah, knowing where somebody is in their Kundalini growth means that you can know roughly the sort of things that they need to learn. And, a very important one is the heart chakra, um, attachment to loving relationships, but growing, getting people to the heart chakra as quickly as possible is very important when it comes to the global awakening, let's say, where we need to change the course, or not change, but we need to encourage the mass awakening of the planet. And for that to actually change the trajectory of the planet. But to do that, we have to get as many people as we can, at least up to the heart chakra, so that encourages compassion. Yeah, well, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And now we're kind of talking about planetary cycles in a way. We're going on to the global awakening, and the inevitability of the global awakening and the different cycles in the planet. And so, the age of suffering is part of the cycles of the planet, and the global awakening happens. And then the age of self-realization, the golden age of self-realization starts. But yes, so things can increase. But if we look at the details, well, why is it increasing? It's because it's about culture at the end of the day. If you look back, let's say 500,000 years in human history, there wasn't much culture of or understanding, let's say, of self-realization. So things were progressing quite slowly. And you can also, even with the advances or intelligence of humanity, I suppose, there were long periods of time where less was happening, rather than lately lots is happening in short periods of time, let's say. Well, it's a little bit similar to that. And if you change the culture, then things go really quickly. So with spiritual evolution, if the whole culture of the planet was all angled towards the goal, then naturally it speeds up, because everyone is learning quicker. And that's what happens just before the global awakening. Now, there's lots of other things to consider. There's lots of negative things that happen, of course, in just before the global awakening, and we're experiencing that as well. But really, it's actually, like you've just said, getting to a pinch point or a bottleneck where this is what actually causes the global awakening. Let's say conflict. Conflict in the planet actually causes the global awakening. And then at that point, or after that point, let's say, the culture completely changes, and self-realization becomes the most important thing on the planet, instead of materialistic viewpoints, let's say, shallow materialistic ideology that is prevalent at the moment. But then after that, the culture changes, doesn't it? And when the culture changes, everyone's learning much quicker. So spiritual evolution speeds up. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's a good philosophy, and it will work with people who, let's say, you've either burnt their karma off before you do that, because I think what you're talking about there is, I think that you've already burnt their karma away, which is why maybe it's working. But if somebody's chock full of negative karma, it produces really negative emotions, which is why some people will never listen. They will never change that, because they're constantly, the emotions are too great. The psychology in the mind, which is linked, is too much. So it prevents people from seeing the truth, let's say, which is why we need to actually, part of our healing system is to remove people's negative karma. That's another thing that we do as part of the structuring the healing journey, is to identify which areas of negative karma they still have, where it is on the energy body, which emotions and which context it relates to, and then target it and remove it with energy healing, because it gives them the like a leg up, doesn't it? Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's loads of different things in there that that you could pull apart there, because if you're talking like an epiphany of some kind, then that happens exactly how you've just said. Something a moment in somebody's life which changes the course of their life, and that may well be planned by their higher mind for that particular purpose, or maybe their higher mind hasn't planned it and it's happened as part of the infinite deterministic plan. But either way, it has the same effect. Or there's the concept of Kundalini awakening, which is another story, really. Whether that can happen in the dying moments, let's say. I think I think it has happened, to be honest with you, but I think it's extremely rare, because normally when you go through a Kundalini awakening, actually, I'll roll back on that a little bit. I think that if somebody has a Kundalini awakening just before they die, then they will most likely come back for a next incarnation to finish off that Kundalini awakening, because the Kundalini phase is quite a journey in itself. There's three Kundalini energies in the Kundalini system, which all have to move. There's one that goes up the spine and up to the bindu. There's one that comes down from the ninth chakra down to the crown chakra, and there's one that in section 3, which is a small section just here from the crown chakra to the bindu. We'll learn about all that. Don't worry, but it's quite a process that has to happen, and it has to happen in a material incarnation. So some people can have a Kundalini awakening and then not finish the Kundalini phase in this incarnation, and then finish it in the next incarnation. That's perfectly possible. In fact, my mother did that, so I know that's possible, and I've seen it in other people as well. So I don't think it's possible or I don't think it happens that we can have a Kundalini awakening in the dying moments and then be finished and then not come back and finish it off, basically. Because it's a biological process that's happening as well. It's like an anatomical process. All right, anybody else? It's a biological process, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think there you're bridging the gap between spirituality and science then, I guess you could say, can't you? Because there is a big divide there, isn't there? And really, it's the same thing. Really, it's a way of trying to understand the world, I suppose you could say. But especially when it comes to reincarnation and spiritual evolution, it's this biological evolution. It's the same thing, spiritual evolution, and we're all on the same journey. And everyone will get to the end of the journey, because it doesn't end. But everyone will get to the goal of the journey. That's the whole point of the universe, isn't it? Constantly doing it again and again and again and again. Surrender, yeah, sure. So surrender, right? Yeah, no, absolutely. So surrender is a very popular word, I would say, in spirituality already, and it's been used for a long, long time. And again, it's sort of evolved into slightly different meanings and that. But surrender itself, if you really dig down into what happens during the self-realization process, surrender is the lower mind, actually. The lower mind, well, there's different stages of surrender. It's a journey, I have to say. So first of all, the ego, the identity. By the way, when I use the word ego, I'm talking about identity of the lower mind. It's that mechanism in the lower mind and brain which creates that little sense of self, that little identity, the identity of the personality, which is a natural part of our evolution, of course. So first of all, when Kundalini first happens, the ego has to go through a level of surrendering. It has to start to realize that it's not in control. And then through the Kundalini phase, as the Kundalini awakenings, as you get further up the spine with K1, one of the energies that's moving, the ego starts to crumble and shatter. It's at the solar plexus level, actually, because the solar plexus is where the ego is finalized. Identification with beliefs, identity. So when the Kundalini goes past the solar plexus, the ego starts to shatter into pieces. And then you go through the rest of the Kundalini phase and you go into the phase of self-realization. But really, the journey of surrender is only just starting here, because the lower mind is still there. This is why it doesn't feel all that different when you go from Kundalini phase into phase of self-realization, because the lower mind is still there with all the psychology in the mind, with all the thought patterns. All that has got a lot of work that needs to be done to it. But the journey is out of your hands at that point, because at the Kundalini, at the point of the Kundalini, end of the Kundalini phase, the higher mind takes over. Your higher mind takes over 100%. You could say that this is the point where free will disappears, if you think that free will was ever a thing anyway. But the lower mind no longer has any control whatsoever. The higher mind's taking control. But this is really hard for the lower mind. It's a difficult process because the lower mind has to give up its control over everything in its life. Eventually, it has to actually disappear completely as well. But I'll give you an example here. As you go through the journey of surrender, one thing that has to be let go of or surrendered is planning and strategizing, for example. The lower mind has evolved as a mechanism to keep the material body alive. That's really all the lower mind and brain is there for, to be honest with you. But it does that and it evolved and learned a very sophisticated way of trying to control the future, to try and keep it alive. Planning, strategizing, always worrying about the future. So it's used to doing it. That's how the lower mind and brain functions. But through the journey of self-realization, it all gets turned on its head, and the lower mind has to completely let go of any planning, of any structure. And that is actually really difficult. When I say difficult, there's no choice. It's not like you're working towards doing it. It happens to you. And it's difficult because it's painful. And the higher mind will often batter the lower mind severely in all sorts of ways. That's why the journey of self-realization, certainly the first part, is not always that easy. There can be a lot of negative stuff that we have to deal with in the journey of self-realization. It's not all pleasant. That comes later on, but we have to get rid of the baggage and the conditioning first. And surrendering is part of that. Surrendering our control over anything. So first of all, the lower mind has to come to terms with it's not in charge anymore. That's the first thing. And then the lower mind has to realize that the higher mind is in control of everything. And alongside that grows trust. Because at the start, the lower mind doesn't trust anything. But through that journey of surrender, trust grows and grows and grows and grows. So the lower mind has to completely trust that the higher mind has it all covered. So the lower mind has to just sit back, put his hands up and say, I surrender. I surrender my life. I surrender everything that I thought I was. I even surrender the identity, who I think I am, the personality. That's not who I am. In fact, and as you go through the journey, the lower mind has to say, in fact, I don't even exist. I'm an illusion. So this journey of surrender is a long one, but that is the general gist of it. And eventually, the higher mind and the lower mind actually start coming together as one, as a hybrid. At that point, surrender is still happening, but you are then surrendering to the source of the universe. You then surrender your entire being. Now, some of this can be quite difficult. You go through periods of actually having to surrender any attachment to the material body, for example, because the lower mind and brain tends to be very attached to the material body. So that's part of the journey, is to actually let go of any attachment to physicality whatsoever. And as you go through that, the lower mind, or at some point, let's just say you, have to actually give up your, in a way, metaphorically, really, give up your existence that you thought you were, because it was an illusion anyway. And this is when the new identity comes in. This is when the true identity comes in, and the awareness starts to grow in you. And then your identity gets transferred to that awareness. And that awareness starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger and grow outside of you. And then you start to realize that is the universal awareness, and that is you. You don't need that old personality who you thought you were. And then at some point you get to a fully surrendered state. So what you're describing there, it's great. What you're describing there is a non-attachment to outcomes. So that's part of surrendering, is to not be attached to the outcomes of actions. So as you go through surrender, you'll be made to do things by your higher mind. Surrendering is not actually just sitting there and doing nothing. That's what's going on in here. But your higher mind is making you do all sorts of stuff. But we have to be non-attached, not attached to the outcomes, because that is desire. So we're going into another aspect of self-realization, where the removal of desire, because a desire for a particular outcome actually starts to disappear through the journey of surrender. And in the end, you're just doing stuff, and you have no wanting for it to go any particular way whatsoever. Now, this is also linked to trust, because who would do that? It sounds mad, right? But you have to start to trust that the infinite deterministic plan of the source has it covered, because you start to move back onto the infinite deterministic plan of the source through the journey of surrender. And you have to start trusting that. And you get little glimpses along the way. It shows you. It's like, oh, okay, that was already organized. Ah, I see. I get it. I don't have to worry about any of that anymore. Just to go back to an earlier point about action or non-action. Surrender is not about not doing things. It's not about not making any changes, let's say. It's all about what's going on in here. So if there are things that are happening in the world which are not right, your intuition tells you they should stop. You can still go out and stop them. You can still go out and say, no, that's not right, that shouldn't happen. But it's the resistance in here that disappears. Because inside, if we're angry about something, if it makes us angry or fearful, then that's a type of resistance. And that disappears through the journey of surrender. So in the end, you're just going around doing things, whatever you're directed to by your higher mind. And that could mean taking very strong action in something. But in here, there's just peace. There's no resistance. There's no anger. There's no negative emotion. And that's what a surrendered mind would be. So yes, surrender, I think, going back to your surrender doesn't mean non-action. Yeah. Well, yeah, you've described it well there. The certain medical things get dragged through our process. And medical things are a classic. And they will get used as part of your process. And be aware, there is no holds barred with the higher mind as well. It will use whatever you are most attached to, because it's the very attachment which needs to be ironed out. So whatever is the dearest to you, unfortunately, tends to get used a little bit. I'm not spreading negativity here. It's just the way that the process happens. That the higher mind will manipulate and beat the lower mind in whatever it's attached to. However, on the positive side of things, it does depend on people's difficulty through the process depends on how much karma was left over when they started the process. So, by the way, when I say process, I'm talking about from the end of the Kundalini phase onwards. That's when we use the word process, it's the self realization process. So, the phase of self realization. So, whenever somebody gets to that point, whatever was left over, whatever tiny, I mean, we're talking tiny amounts, but whatever was left over gets dragged through the process. And so some people tend to have quite a heavy one, a difficult one, and then some people have a very easy, breezy one. Just depends on at what point they were going into that process, really. But the journey of surrender is pretty standard, although I'm saying not completely, because it also depends on the strength of the identity that was there before as well. Like, for example, I struggled a lot with the losing control of things. That's why I use that example a lot, because I struggled a lot with that, because my whole life was all about taking control of things, really. I worked on boats and the best way of staying safe on the water is to control every aspect of it, really. So my identity, egoic identity, was very used to making sure everything was in control, making sure everything was in its box, everything's organized, and so losing that was very difficult for me. So, but everyone's slightly different. Everyone's makeup is slightly different, so everyone might experience it slightly different. Anyone else? Well, what you said earlier, actually, I'm going to pick up on, and you said finding balance. Well, I would say that let's extend our viewpoint into many, many, many incarnations, and then you do find balance. So sometimes you'll incarnate into a particular life for a particular reason to learn certain lessons, and another time you'll incarnate into a different type of life, a completely different type of life, to learn different lessons from that other one. So I know we have had many, many incarnations with that type of isolated life, where a monk or a nun or something like that, living alone, learning completely different lessons than we would, say, in a very busy society. But then, the next life you may, you've gone into that life to learn stillness and meditation and self-healing exercises, and trying to find that awareness, trying to find that peace within. But then in the next incarnation, you've got a different life plan, and you might not even do anything like that, but you're learning different lessons, and you might go into a real busy environment. Your goals, some parts of your goals of life may be actually to create change or progression, or to help move society along in some way, and that's quite often a very eventful life, let's say, but also a very tricky life. And you might not be doing any meditating in that life, but it's just different lessons, different lives. But over the long, long term, you get a balance of all of them. Yeah, so that's really interesting. Now we're touching on the idea of personality projection. Now, this is really, really getting into the details of self-realization, which we don't really talk about in this course, in fact. But what you're talking about is, what happens is that as you go through self-realization, and not in the latter stages, it starts straight away, really, but the personality in the lower mind disappears eventually. The brain disappears, but you still have a personality projection. And it is based on the personality that was there, because we still have to have a way of interacting with the world around us. And that's what personalities are for. That's what the egoic identity evolved to do, is to separate individuals within a group of social animals. That's why it's there. So it's a natural thing, and it's what people use to interact with each other, of course. So as you go through self-realization, you don't just become nothing. You become nothing in one way, but in another way, there is still a soul there. There is still a person there, and what comes out of you is what we call a personality projection. So it's kind of like the illusion of a personality for those around you, but inside you're just clear. You're just clear. You're just peace. You know. So in the moments where you're on your own, for example, and let's say you've got a moment to yourself for 5 minutes, you just close your eyes. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. There's no wants and desires. There's no likes or dislikes. It's just a peaceful nothing inside. Well, it's also outside as well. But as soon as you're involved with communicating, you spring into action, and a personality projection comes out. So I would say that certain likes and dislikes, like clothes and colours and things like that, is part of the personality projection. Okay, great, excellent. So that makes me explain what happens with karma. So yeah, nice one. So basically, with karma, what happens is that you stop making karma. So, and this is actually known, this is actually very well known in many Eastern spiritual traditions, that at some point you stop making karma at all. And the point where you stop making karma through self-realization is actually the Kundalini phase. So the phase that you are in now, you're not making any karma whatsoever. In fact, the first phase of self-realization is called the emotion engine, and actually you get rid of all your remaining karma, tiny amounts, but you get rid of all of it, and that's it for good. You don't create anymore, because there is a Kundalini energy called K4. There's four Kundalini energies that we talk about. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the fourth one actually happens at the point of the end of the Kundalini phase. At that point, as you're finishing the Kundalini phase, a Kundalini energy comes into the lower mind and starts to travel about. We call it percolation. But the first thing it does is actually it breaks the karma organs. Now, the karma organs are in the lower mind, or we're going to talk about anatomy a lot during this course. There are actual subtle energy organs in the lower mind that produce karma and process karma. And that K4 energy comes along and it breaks them pretty much. That's part of the transformation. So there is no more karma being produced, because the process of self-realization is actually a transformation and a coming together of the lower mind and higher mind. So lots of different bits and pieces actually disappear. So there's no more, there's no more karma at all that you can produce. But also, going back to your question, I want to also say that part of it is a growing level of trust that nothing bad can happen. And that's part of surrendering as well, is to trust your higher mind. And that means that you have to completely trust in the process, that nothing out of place can actually happen. It's all part of the process, and we have to approach it with hands up in a way. It's a complete reversal from before, by the way, and this is why it can be a bit derailing, because before it's all about self-discipline. The lower mind has to discipline the lower mind to get to the goal, and you've got the higher mind in the background feeding it intuition to guide it. But ultimately, self-discipline is the lower mind disciplining itself. So you're used to doing that. We're all used to doing that. But then when you go through self-realization, everything gets flipped on its head completely. And it's the opposite. Self-discipline no longer exists anymore. And it's the complete opposite. You have to throw your arms up in surrender and say everything is already planned. It's all down to the higher mind. Right, I think we're kind of there, really, aren't we?